Good morning, everyone. What a wonderful scenario it is to see God's children lifting their hands together. It's an opportunity that God has granted to all of us. Last time I saw a picture of a building, a skyscraper. And as I was looking at that, I was really fascinated of its height and fascinated of its record. I'm pertaining to the building or the tower called Burj Khalifa. It's in the UAE, and some of you probably may have visited this place already in the past. And I believe when you were there, you were also fascinated of the beauty of the building and its record. Have you seen this building already, even in the picture? Kindly see it in the next slide. That is Burj Khalifa. Burj means tower. And it reaches to 868 feet or 2,716.5 feet. 868 meters. We don't have like that in the Philippines. And as I was looking at it, I am really surprised of how human beings' ingenuity have gone so far. And I'm so surprised that it is able to stand in the midst of a desert. Because a sandy place is not a good ground for you to build a skyscraper. We have engineers here and I believe they would agree with me. Pag sandy, it's loose and it is not good in holding the building. But as I was looking at its height, I could not neglect myself from pondering about its foundation. Because if you are going to erect a tower like this in a sandy ground, you must have built an incredible foundation underneath so that it would keep on standing. And fascinating because in this place, this building stands until today, and it holds the record as the tallest building in the world. Though I also have read an article that there is a building under construction which would stand 1,000 meters in 2019. But until that building is finished, Burj Khalifa would continue to be the tallest building in the world. Skyscrapers like that could soar in the sky because it has a strong foundation. And as I was thinking about this reality, this observation, I also noticed that the same concept applies to the church. That when you look at the church today, it rises above the clouds, despite the many challenges that it has gone through in the past. Even during the early Christianity, during the emperors, you can see that the church has gone through a lot of difficult moments that shook Christianity. And yet, when you look at the events, the church is still happy, is still standing today, like a skyscraper reaching the skies, not because of its beauty by itself, not because of its own ability to face the challenges of time, but because it is standing on a solid ground, that it has a strong foundation that nobody on earth and in the entire universe can destroy. And I'm talking about the foundation of Christianity, which is no other than Jesus Christ Himself. When you look at the writings of Paul in the book of 1 Corinthians, let us look at these writings of the apostle. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 10 to 15. And you and I will be able to see today that the church would keep on standing even in the future because it stands on a solid rock, who is Jesus. I'll read from the NASB, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 10 to 15. It says here, "According to the grace of God, which was given to me, like a wise master builder, I laid the foundation, and another is building on it. But each man must be careful how he builds on it, for no man can lay a foundation other than the one who is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now if any man builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident. For the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire, and fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. If any man's work which he has built on it remains, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. May the good Lord bless the reading of His words. Now let us take note of verse 10 specifically. It was Paul who wrote this letter to the city of Corinth, to the believers in Corinth. And I want us to take note, next slide please. I want us to take note of this statement that he said, I laid a foundation. And how did he do that? He described himself as a master builder. Okay, I can see some engineers in our midst today, and I believe there are some architects also. Paul described himself as a master builder. When you look at the original language, the word master builder, you would read it as architecton. Architecton. Maybe the word architect that we use today came from this Greek statement architecton, in which it means master builder. So take note of that. Paul used the statement architecton to pertain to himself as the one who started the church in Corinth. Let's look at some historical background of the church. When you go back to the history, AD 51 or 52, Paul visited Corinth. There was no church back then. And then he began to stay there and resided there for 8 months. And while he was there, it was then when he met Priscilla, Aquila, and in the later part of his stay in Corinth, he also met Apollos. These were the early believers in the city of Corinth. Next slide, please, so that the people would see it, and you can, maybe some of you are jotting down. About AD 51 or 52. And then through that early ministry, the Apostle Paul was able to share Jesus Christ to many of the people there. And there were early believers who embraced Christianity and became the very foundation of the church. That is why, when we go back to the previous slide, we can see that Paul described himself as the architecton, the master builder. When you know back then, when they used the word master builder or architecton, he's thinking about the one who is responsible in beginning the church and the one who's responsible in its growth. And that is why you would be able to see that Paul is very concerned about the church in Corinth. Take note that the book that we are reading right now, this was a letter to the church. And Paul was thinking of himself as an architect, as someone responsible of the beginning, an instrument of God used by the Lord to start the church in Corinth, and that he is also responsible of the growth and the sustenance of the church. So he kept on connecting to the believers there. And in fact, he had 3 letters. When you look at the Bible today, we have only the 1 Corinthians and the 2 Corinthians. But somewhere in the second letter, 2 Corinthians, he mentioned that there was a letter that is missing. Back then, when you send a message, you have to ask a person, a servant who can bring the letter to the recipient. Today, thank God for the internet or to the technology that we have, you just text. And without disturbing someone, you can bring the message to another person, even if he's on the other side of the globe. There's no problem this time when it comes to communicating to other people. But back then, if you want to communicate someone who is staying in Cagayan de Oro City, then you'll write a letter. And during the time of Paul, you have to ask a servant who would personally deliver the letter to the recipient. And probably in the course of this delivering of the letter, it was misplaced, or maybe the courier was able to bring it to the recipient, but the one who received it also misplaced it. We don't know. But Paul mentioned it as something that is missing. So we have the 1 and 2 Corinthians, but that would tell us that he was very concerned of the church in Corinth. That is why he calls himself the architecton, the one who is responsible for the very beginning of it and the sustenance of the church. But take note of this also. The same apostle, the same person who wrote and called himself I laid the foundation, as an architecton, I laid the foundation of the church in Corinth. Said the same statement. He continued, and another is building on it. In other words, after he stayed there for 8 months, he left, and then left with another leader that could lead the church. And so the church kept on growing. The church continued to exist while he was away. And the one who's leading the church is another person who is building the church. You know, leaders would come and go. If you look at the history of ZCAEC, there were many pastors in the past who came here already and then left, and then another pastor came and then left, another pastor came and left. Leaders would come and go. But the ones that God has planted would continue this regardless of who the leader is. That is why when you look at the following statement, Paul said, but each man must be careful how he builds on it. For no man can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Paul acknowledged himself to be the architecton in the local church in Corinth. But what is he trying to say in the last statement that I highlighted there? Paul is trying to tell to his readers that, yes, I am the architecton or the instrument that was used by God to build the local church, but in the overall perspective, it is not my strength. It was Jesus Christ who's there, lying beneath that church that I've started. It is Jesus there, holding the church that I have started. And thus, from the bigger perspective and a deeper sense, the very foundation of it is not the Apostle Paul himself, but Jesus Christ who laid his life down at the cross at Calvary. That is why Paul was very careful about it. That today, in any ministry, no pastor should be able to say, I am the one who started it, and I am an indispensable person in this organization because I am the one who started it. Yes, you might be an instrument of God in beginning such an organization, such a movement, but in real sense, it was God who used you as an instrument, and now that Christian organization or the church is standing not because of you. It is standing because the foundation is very strong, who is Jesus Christ. Because if you look at the history of the church, we have gone through a lot of difficulties. I'll read some part of history to you this morning that would inform us about the difficulties of some difficulties that Christianity has gone through in the past. If you look at the year AD 64, what happened? A very significant event took place. The first persecution, a massive persecution, headed by Emperor Nero, cracked down on Christianity at the city. He burned, according to some scholars, he burned the city of Rome, and he told everyone that it was the Christians who did that. And because of that, every citizen in Rome hated the Christians. Persecution was widespread back then. That was AD 64. And if you continue in history, in the 3rd century, 250 AD in particular, Decius required all citizens of the empire to sacrifice to the emperor and receive a certificate to prove they had done this. And you know who they sacrificed? Christians. So when you look at the history of Christianity, there were several moments in the past that you and I would be able to say, we were threatened, we were shaken. And there were several attempts to stop Christianity, to end it. But I am surprised. All through those difficult moments in the past, Christianity continues to stand until today. That was AD 250. And another persecution happened in 303 AD, often called the Great Persecution. Several thousand Christians were killed, including many Christian leaders. And this was one of the most trying moments for Christianity, but religion was able to survive and eventually triumph. Many more. And after such massacres, Christianity also faced intellectual attacks. There were many heresies that confronted us. There were many controversies that confronted us. But today, we are in the year 2018, and Christianity is still standing strong. Why? Is it because we have great leaders in the past? Is it because we have great, weapons that we use against those who go against us? No. The answer is found in the writings of the Apostle Paul, that Christianity is still standing even until today only because it stands on a solid rock, who is Jesus Christ Himself. And I can see that kind of perspective, or that kind of reality taking place not only in the bigger perspective, that reality also happens even in this church, ZCAEC. Someone told me, Pastor, there are really things in the past that you need to forget. Mga hugot na linya. May mga bagay sa nakaraan na hindi na dapat gunitain. O, diba? Mga hugot. And I agree with that statement. But as I was pondering on the history of ZCAEC, you know what? To those of you who have been here for more than 20 years or even more than 15 years, we have gone through a lot of difficult, trying times as a church. You can still remember that. The name ZCAEC appeared in a newspaper. And the one who wrote was trying to say that, is this Christianity? And this church, who is supposed to be a light in the community, is now becoming a problem. Because believers is against another believer. ZCAEC's name appeared even inside a court. And that breaks my heart. We had a lot of tough moments as a church. But where are we today? We are still alive, standing, and becoming a light in Zamboanga City. Why does that happen? Is it because of the program that we implement? Is it because of the facilities that we have? I don't think so. ZCAEC is still here until today only because it stands on a solid rock, who is Jesus Christ Himself. Can you say amen to that? Maybe some people are worrying about what is going to happen in the future. What will happen with our kids growing up in the future? Because we are confronted by many moral issues today. Some people would say, let's accept the same-sex marriage. Some people would say, there is a problem in the world of politics today, and that affects the church. Well, if you are worrying about it, it's time for you to change your mind this moment. Because the existence of the church is not dependent on any political condition. It is not dependent on any moral issue, but it is dependent on the very foundation where it stands, and that is Jesus Christ Himself. That is why the Apostle Paul said, let us be very careful, because we are standing on the foundation, and there is no other foundation which is holding us, but the one that has been laid already at the cross on Calvary, and that is Jesus Christ. What an amazing truth that Paul is conveying to us today. And he mentioned further. Let's look at the next slide. One more. He said there, now if any man builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident, for the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire, and fire itself will test the quality of each work. What does he mean by that? Paul did not specifically mention what he meant by this gold, silver, precious stones. But as I have observed these materials in building a structure, I have observed that they could be classified into two. Because he also mentioned fire, these materials can be classified into two: combustible and non-combustible. When you look at the gold, stone, precious stone, silver, these are things or materials that cannot be consumed by fire. And when you look at the wood, hay, straw, you light a fire on these materials. Later, very soon, they'll be gone. What is he trying to say? He's saying that the church survival would be composed of these both. But those things that were really ordained by God to be done would last until forever. We don't know exactly what he was pertaining to, but most likely these are truths that are directly connected to the very foundation of Christianity, who is Jesus. Something that will last. When you begin to teach that salvation is not by works but only by the grace of Jesus, that's something that will last. When you begin to think that we don't need to work for our salvation, but we just have to open our lives and trust Jesus, that is something that will last. But when you begin to think of programs in the church, but when you begin to think about activities that we do, that may be effective at some point of time. But a week, a month, or a year, or 2 years later, or even a decade later, it will be gone. There are things that we do which are permanent, and there are things that are temporal. But regardless of what it may be, as long as we are doing it in God's kingdom, it is helping the Lord in building His kingdom. For we are His instruments of grace. There are two things that I want us to remember when we go home. Two things. And I hope this is going to give us perspective. First is this: the foundation of the church is Jesus Christ. Thus, all who become part of it should be aware that they are standing on the solid rock. Let us not think that it is because of the leaders. Some people would say, when that pastor was not here yet, the church was small. But when he came, it became big. The members multiplied. Let's be careful in saying so. Because after all, that pastor could have been an instrument, but the greatest architecton, the one who really is responsible for the growth, beginning and growth of the church, is Jesus Christ. If you are a leader of this church, I am warning you, never say that it is because of us. If you are a member of this church or an attender of this church Sunday to Sunday, I am warning every one of us. When we talk to someone and they would appreciate what we have right now, I am warning everyone, don't say, it is because we are giving to the church. It is because of my contribution. Instead, we would say, it is only by the grace of God, and that building stands for God's goodness, testifying to the world that God provides and God is leading His people. Nobody can take credit. It is only Jesus Christ. After all, this church stands on a solid rock in Christ. Yesterday, with the CE teachers and volunteers, we went to Bolong for a team building activity. And while we were there, my two little ones were playing on the sand. And there were a few children also from afar playing the same. Some of them were building castles. I observed the castle was neatly done, and they made a sand fence also surrounding it. But this is what happened. At the later part of our stay there, the water began to rise again. And as the water reached those sand castles, one after another, they were just drifted by the water and they disappeared. And I remembered what Jesus Christ said, those that build their house on the sand, it will just be gone when the water comes. But those who build their house on the rock pertaining to Himself, it would last until eternity. My friends, let us give God all the honor and praise that He allowed us to stand on the solid rock. There might be challenges in the future. I do not know what trials we would face as a church, but so long that we are there on top of the rock, we will never be destroyed. Another thing is this: every person standing on the solid rock must continue to be willing to be used by God in building His kingdom. This implies that we must build each other as we honor God. Let us build and build God's kingdom. Let us be willing to be His instruments of grace. And as we do that, let's continue to build each other, not destroying each other. I am really hurt whenever I hear someone who's part of the church, destroying someone else who also belonged to the same church. Instead of doing so, it would be a beautiful scenario if we learn to build each other. This is God's church, and this is God's business. May we do it as God intends for us to do it. It is my prayer that these truths would keep on ringing in our hearts, and as we go out there, we would continue to bring it in our day-to-day experience. Do not be shaken. Do not be moved. God is holding us, and He is our strong foundation. There is a wrestler that is named The Rock. You know him, right? You look at his physique, he is really a big person. But in his wrestling career, there were moments that he was defeated. But the Rock in the Scriptures, who is Jesus Christ Himself, He is a strong foundation that there is nothing in the entire universe that can move Him. He is Jesus. Keep on standing on that solid rock. God bless us all, and good morning.